On July 26, 1945, a United States Navy warship quietly slipped away from the island of Tinian in the Western Pacific. No fanfare, no send-off, just a heavy cruiser, 1,195 men, and a secret so enormous that most of the crew had no idea they were carrying it. 4 days earlier, that same ship had delivered the components of the first atomic bomb ever used in warfare. The bomb that would level the city of Hiroshima in less than 2 weeks' time had been sitting in the cargo hold of this ship, and the men walking above it had no idea what it was. Now, the mission was over. The ship was heading south toward the Philippines for routine training exercises, and for most of the men on board, that July evening felt like any other night at sea. Cards were being played, letters were being written, some men were sleeping. A few gathered near the railings to feel the warm Pacific breeze. None of them knew that just after midnight, 2 Japanese torpedoes were already in the water, heading directly for them. And none of them could have known that after the ship sank in just 12 minutes, nearly 900 men would be left floating in the open Pacific Ocean, alone, without rescue, for 4 full days and 5 full nights. And that when the Navy finally found out the ship was missing, it wasn't because anyone noticed, it was by pure accident. This is the story of the USS Indianapolis. And as always, viewer discretion is strongly advised. To understand what happened to the USS Indianapolis and why, you first need to understand what kind of ship she was and what she meant to the men who served on her. The Indianapolis was a Portland-class heavy cruiser. She was launched in 1931, commissioned in 1932, and from the very beginning, she was not just any ship. She was a flagship. She carried admirals. She was chosen to transport President Franklin D. Roosevelt on official voyages. Among naval circles, she had a reputation as one of the finest cruisers in the fleet. She was 186 meters long. That's roughly the length of 2 American football fields laid end to end and displaced nearly 10,000 tons. She was armed with 9 8-inch guns and 8 5-inch anti-aircraft guns. She could reach speeds of over 32 knots, making her one of the faster heavy cruisers of her era. By the spring of 1945, she had earned 10 battle stars, 10 separate combat engagements, 10 separate encounters with the enemy, and through all of it, she had survived. In late March of 1945, that record of survival was interrupted. Off the coast of Okinawa, a Japanese kamikaze plane struck the ship. 9 crew members were killed and 29 were wounded. The Indianapolis was badly damaged and had to be sent back to the United States for repairs. She returned to Mare Island Naval Shipyard in California in April 1945. Repairs took several weeks. New men joined the crew, old hands recovered from their wounds, and then, in mid-July of 1945, the Indianapolis received new orders. Orders so secret that almost nobody on board was told what they were actually for. To understand the secret mission the Indianapolis was about to undertake, you need to know a little about where the Second World War stood in the summer of 1945. In Europe, the war had ended in May. Nazi Germany had surrendered. But in the Pacific, the fighting continued with terrifying intensity. The battle for Okinawa, which had just concluded in June, had cost the United States more than 12,000 lives. Projections for an invasion of the Japanese home islands were even more horrifying. Military planners estimated that a ground invasion could cost between 250,000 and 1 million American lives, and potentially millions of Japanese lives as well. In a laboratory in Los Alamos, New Mexico, scientists had been working for 3 years on a possible alternative, the Manhattan Project, the development of an atomic bomb. On July 16, 1945, the first atomic bomb was successfully tested in the New Mexico desert. The explosion was so powerful that it vaporized the steel tower it was mounted on, fused the desert sand into glass and produced a mushroom cloud that rose to 12,000 meters. The test was called Trinity. The bomb worked. Now there was the question of how to get the weapon to the Pacific. The decision was made to use the USS Indianapolis. She was fast enough to make the trip quickly, and her reputation meant she could be trusted with a cargo of this magnitude. She was loaded at Hunters Point Naval Shipyard in San Francisco with a large wooden crate containing components of the bomb, enriched uranium and other essential parts secured in the ship's hangar. A specially welded metal canister was bolted to the deck. The mission was classified at the highest possible level. Captain Charles McVeigh, the commanding officer, was told only the minimum. He knew the cargo was important. He knew the mission was secret. He knew his destination was Tinian Island. He was not told what was in the crate. On July 16, 1945, the same day as the Trinity test, the Indianapolis departed San Francisco and headed west across the Pacific at maximum speed. She arrived at Pearl Harbor on July 19th, setting a speed record for the leg between San Francisco and Hawaii. She barely stopped. She refueled, took on supplies, and kept going. She arrived at Tinian on July 26th, just 10 days after leaving San Francisco, another speed record. The wooden crate was unloaded by heavily armed guards, transported to scientists waiting on the dock, and within days, the component would be assembled into the bomb known as Little Boy. On August 6, 1945, Little Boy would be dropped on the Japanese city of Hiroshima, killing an estimated 80,000 people instantly. But on July 26th, that was still 11 days away. On July 26th, the mission was over. The Indianapolis had done what she was asked to do. It had delivered the most important cargo in the history of naval warfare without incident. Now she turned south toward the Philippines, toward training exercises and routine duty, and nobody thought anything more of it.
Before we get to what happened next, let's pause for a moment. Because in the hours before the Indianapolis left Tinian, 1,195 human beings were going about the ordinary business of being alive on a warship. They were mostly young. Most of the enlisted men were between 17 and 24 years old. Some had been in the Navy for years. Others had joined just months earlier, and this was their first serious deployment. Harlan Twibble was 22 years old. A fresh graduate of the United States Naval Academy, he had joined the ship just weeks before the mission began. He had wanted to be a naval aviator or a submariner, something glamorous, something fast. Instead, he got assigned to a cruiser. He wasn't particularly thrilled about it, but he was young and ambitious, and he figured he would find his place in history eventually. Harold Bray was 17 years old. He had grown up in a small town in northern Michigan and had joined the Navy as soon as he turned 17 in 1944, eager to serve. At 17, he was almost certainly one of the youngest men on the ship. He had been through boot camp at Great Lakes, Illinois, and now here he was, on one of the most decorated warships in the Pacific Fleet, just days after that ship had helped deliver the weapon that would end the Second World War. Richard Thielen was a sailor from Michigan who had never been to sea before this voyage. He was young and healthy and strong. He had his whole life ahead of him. And there was Magellan Williams, one of 28 African-American sailors on board. Like many black servicemen in the segregated military of 1945, Williams was restricted to menial roles, cleaning, cooking, maintenance, despite being as capable as any man on the ship. He had joined the Navy knowing he would face discrimination. He joined anyway. He served anyway. And before the Indianapolis left on her final mission, he had become engaged. His fiancée was pregnant with their first child. He was going to be a father. He was going to come home, marry her, and start a family.
These were the men who stood on the decks of the Indianapolis as she left Tinian on July 26th. They were writing letters, playing cards, sleeping in their bunks, watching the ocean, thinking about home. Some of them, the lucky ones, were already thinking about the end of the war. Japan was losing. Everyone could feel it. Maybe they'd be home by Christmas. Maybe this was almost over. It was not almost over. Not for them. After leaving Tinian, the Indianapolis stopped briefly at Guam to pick up additional fuel and provisions. It was at Guam that Captain McVeigh requested something important. He asked for an escort. A destroyer escort, a smaller, faster ship specifically designed to protect larger vessels from submarine attacks, was standard procedure for a ship of the Indianapolis's size traveling through waters where Japanese submarines were known to operate. McVeigh knew the route he was being assigned, from Guam to Leyte Gulf in the Philippines, was a potentially dangerous one. He wanted protection. His request was denied. There was no escort available, he was told. He would have to make the journey alone. What McVeigh was not told, what he would only discover decades later after it no longer mattered, was that American naval intelligence had already broken the Japanese naval code. They knew exactly where Japanese submarines were operating in the Pacific, and they knew that a Japanese submarine, the I-58, commanded by Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, was operating in the waters directly along the route McVeigh had been assigned. That intelligence was never passed to McVeigh. He sailed into those waters with no escort, no warning, and no idea that a hunter was already waiting. The Indianapolis was also sailing under what was called Route Petty, a standard shipping lane between Guam and Leyte Gulf. It was not a secret route. Other ships used it regularly. And without an escort, without warning about submarine activity, and without any special precautions, the Indianapolis was simply following the standard path. She departed Guam on July 28th. Her arrival at Leyte was expected on July 31st. The crossing would take approximately 3 days. The seas were moderate. The weather was clear. Captain McVeigh ordered the ship to travel at approximately 15.7 knots. And then, on the night of July 29, 1945, the Indianapolis was steaming south through the Philippine Sea, traveling in a straight line, with no escort, no warning about submarine activity, and 1,195 men on board. And 300 meters below the surface, Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto was looking through his periscope. It was 12:14 in the morning on July 30th, 1945. Most of the crew were asleep. The men on night watch were at their stations, scanning the dark water around the ship. The sea was calm. The sky was scattered with stars. Commander Hashimoto had been tracking the Indianapolis for some time. He had initially thought the shape on the horizon might be a different ship, perhaps a battleship. But as his I-58 crept closer through the depths, he confirmed his target. He was looking at a large American heavy cruiser traveling in a straight line without escort. He ordered his crew to fire. 2 Type 95 torpedoes left the I-58 in rapid succession. They crossed the 300 meters of dark water between the I-58 and the Indianapolis in seconds. The first torpedo struck the bow of the ship. The explosion was massive. It destroyed the bow section entirely, vaporized the men sleeping in the forward compartments, and sent a column of fire and debris hundreds of feet into the air. The second torpedo struck amidships, near the center of the ship, hitting directly beneath the fuel tanks and the powder magazines. This explosion was even larger than the first. It detonated the ship's own ammunition. The resulting blast was so powerful that it blew out the ship's keel, the backbone of the hull, and cracked the ship open. Men who were asleep in their bunks were thrown across their compartments. Men on deck were knocked off their feet by the shock waves. The lights went out across the entire ship instantly. In the dark, with the ship listing badly to starboard, fire spreading rapidly from the bow,
and the internal structure failing, the crew had to make immediate decisions in a matter of seconds with almost no information. Captain McVeigh attempted to send a distress signal. 3 separate distress signals were transmitted from the Indianapolis in the minutes after the torpedoes hit. The first went out as the ship was still above water. All 3 signals were received by nearby stations. All 3 were ignored or mishandled. We will come back to that. The ship was going down fast, 12 minutes. From the moment the first torpedo struck to the moment the stern rose out of the water and the Indianapolis slipped below the surface, 12 minutes. For comparison, the Titanic took 2 hours and 40 minutes to sink after striking an iceberg. The Indianapolis was gone in 12 minutes. In that 12 minutes, the crew had to fight through darkness, fire, smoke, explosions, a severe list, and complete chaos to try to abandon ship. Many never made it out. Approximately 890 men went down with the Indianapolis. But approximately 890 men made it into the water. And now came the part that nobody was prepared for.
When you go over the side of a sinking warship in the middle of the Pacific Ocean at 1 in the morning, the immediate reality is overwhelming. The water was warm. The Philippine Sea at that latitude in late July is around 28 degrees Celsius, but that warmth would prove deceptive. The men who entered the water were scattered across a large area. The ship had been moving when she sank, and men had entered the water at different points across several hundred meters of ocean. Some were lucky. Near the ship, debris was floating. Wooden crates, floater nets, pieces of the superstructure. A handful of life rafts had been successfully launched. Men near this debris could grab onto something solid, could lie down, could rest. Most were not lucky. Most entered the water with only their life jackets. And those life jackets, standard Navy kapok jackets, were not designed for extended time in the water. They would keep a man afloat for approximately 48 hours before the kapok absorbed enough water to lose its buoyancy. After that, a man would have to tread water to stay afloat. After 4 or 5 days, treading water would be physically impossible for anyone. Harlan Twibble, the 22-year-old Naval Academy graduate, surfaced near a group of several hundred men. He was the only officer among them. He was wounded from the explosions. He was in the middle of the Pacific Ocean at 1 in the morning with no ship, no food, no fresh water, and no idea whether anyone knew they were there. He started counting heads. He needed to know how many men were in his group. He found himself responsible for approximately 325 survivors. He later recalled the moment with remarkable clarity. Everybody was scared to death, he said. These were all 18 and 19-year-old kids. But despite the fear, despite the darkness, despite everything, the men were calm, at first. There wasn't any fighting, any turmoil, Twibble said, but everybody was scared. Young Harold Bray, 17 years old, surfaced somewhere in the dark water and grabbed on to whatever he could find. He was alive. He had survived the sinking. He didn't know yet how fortunate that was going to turn out to be, relatively speaking. Across the water, in scattered groups separated by hundreds of meters, nearly 900 men bobbed in the dark Philippine Sea and waited for rescue. Nobody was coming. This is the part of the story that is, in some ways, even more disturbing than the sinking itself. The Indianapolis had sent 3 distress signals before she went under. 3 separate transmissions in the moments after the torpedoes hit, saying that the ship had been struck and was going down. 3 signals that, if acted upon immediately, could have had rescue ships on scene within hours, while most of the 890 men in the water were still alive. Not one of those signals was properly acted upon. The first signal was received by a naval station at Leyte Gulf. The officer on duty was intoxicated. He dismissed it and went back to sleep. The second signal reached a station at Tacloban in the Philippines.
There, the commanding officer had issued standing orders that he was not to be disturbed at night for any reason. The signal was logged. Nobody woke the commanding officer. The third signal reached a station at the naval base at Guam. There, it was dismissed as either a Japanese trick. The enemy sometimes sent fake distress signals to lure American ships into ambush, or as a radio error. The signal was not acted upon. 3 distress signals, 3 failures, 3 separate moments where somebody could have picked up a phone and said a ship is sinking, send help immediately, and chose not to. And then there was the second failure. The Indianapolis was expected to arrive at Leyte Gulf in the Philippines on July 31st, the day after she sank. When she didn't arrive, the standard procedure was for the port to notify the appropriate command that a ship had not appeared as scheduled. Nobody did this. The Indianapolis was simply not reported as overdue. She was logged in the movement report system as having departed Guam, and when she didn't arrive at Leyte, that arrival was simply never noted. The system had a critical flaw. Arriving ships were logged, but failing to arrive ships were not automatically flagged as missing. And so the absence of the Indianapolis in the chaos and volume of wartime naval traffic simply slipped through the cracks. One more chance gone. Scholars and historians have since identified at least 11 separate moments in the 48 hours after the Indianapolis sank when the Navy had information that could have led to rescue, and each time, through negligence, bureaucratic failure, or simple incompetence, that information was not acted upon. The result was that the men of the USS Indianapolis floated in the Philippine Sea for 4 days and 5 nights with no rescue coming. And then the sharks arrived.
Let's be very clear about something right from the start. The sinking of the USS Indianapolis is often called the worst shark attack in history. And while that description isn't entirely wrong, it is dramatically misleading, and the survivors themselves were frustrated by it for the rest of their lives. The sharks were real. They were terrifying. They killed men. But they were not the main killer. The main killer was dehydration. The main killer was saltwater poisoning. The main killer was exposure to the blazing Pacific sun for 16 hours a day, with no shade, no fresh water, and no food. The main killer was hallucination. The main killer was men losing their minds and swimming toward mirages they thought were ships and never coming back. But let's talk about the sharks, because they were there and they were horrifying. The explosion that sank the Indianapolis sent massive amounts of blood, oil, and organic material into the water. In the warm Philippine Sea, that acted as a beacon across enormous distances for one of the ocean's most efficient predators. The species responsible for most of the attacks was the oceanic white-tip shark, a deep-water species with a reputation among marine biologists as one of the most dangerous sharks in the world. Unlike the more famous great white, oceanic white-tips are persistent. They are not deterred easily. They circle, they wait, they test, and when they attack, they often do not let go. The sharks arrived during the first night, within hours of the sinking. At first, they were feeding on the bodies of the men who had gone down with the ship, or on the bodies of men who had died of wounds after entering the water. The living could hear them and feel them in the dark, but the sharks, in those first hours, were not primarily targeting the survivors. By the second day, that had changed. Men who had drifted away from the larger groups, men who were weak, wounded, or already beginning to hallucinate, became targets. The sharks moved quickly, quietly, and without warning. A man would be there, and then he would be gone. Sometimes you would hear a scream. Sometimes there was no sound at all. Harlan Twyble organized what he called shark watches in his group. Men took turns staying alert, watching the dark water below, kicking and hitting when a shark came close. The sharks, Twyble observed, tended to avoid the larger groups when the men were active and fighting back. It was the stragglers who were most at risk. But there was only so much anyone could do.
Men were dying from other causes, and their bodies attracted more sharks. The rafts and floater nets that some groups had managed to grab were becoming platforms from which men could reach down and try to pull the weakest survivors aboard. But the weakest survivors were often so far gone by then that they were impossible to revive. Estimates of how many men were killed directly by sharks range from a few dozen to 150. The uncertainty itself tells you something about the chaos of those 4 days. Nobody was keeping count because everyone was simply trying to stay alive. Let's walk through the 4 days, hour by hour, because it's important to understand not just what happened, but how long it happened for. Day 1, July 30th, 1945. The ship sank just after midnight. The men entered the water in darkness. They could hear each other but often couldn't see each other. They organized themselves as best they could into groups. Some had life rafts. Most had only their life jackets. In the early hours of that morning, the sharks arrived. The men who had been most seriously wounded in the explosions, men with open wounds in the water, were the first to be taken. As dawn broke on July 30th, the men could see each other clearly for the first time. They could see the scale of the disaster. They could see how many of them there were, scattered across a wide area of ocean. Some groups were close enough to see each other, but too far apart to communicate. Some men were already floating face down. The sun rose and began to beat down. Without shade, in direct tropical sun, the air temperature above the water surface quickly reached 35 to 40 degrees Celsius. The men had no hats, no sunscreen, no shade of any kind. The sunburn began within hours. By afternoon, the exposed skin of the men, their faces, their necks, their arms, was severely burned. Blistering began. The pain was intense. The thirst was worse. Day 2, July 31st, 1945. This was the day the Indianapolis was supposed to arrive at Lake Gulf. This was the day she was supposed to be logged as overdue. This was the day someone was supposed to notice she was missing. Nobody noticed. The men in the water had now been floating for 24 hours. Some were beginning to drink seawater. The hallucinations in those men were already beginning. The groups that had managed to maintain discipline, groups like Twibbles where an officer was maintaining order, were doing better, but no group was doing well. The sharks were now bolder. They had been circling throughout the first night. Now they were attacking during daylight. Men were being pulled under within sight of their companions, and there was nothing anyone could do. The Kapok life jackets were beginning to absorb water. Men who had been relying on their jackets to keep them afloat were beginning to feel the difference. A gradual, terrifying heaviness that required increasing effort to compensate for. Day 3, August 1st, 1945. By the third day, the groups were thinning rapidly. The weakest men had died during the second night, from wounds, from dehydration, from saltwater poisoning, from hypothermia during the cold Pacific nights. Their bodies were left in the water. The sharks fed on the dead. The hallucinations had spread through many of the groups now, even among men who had not drunk seawater. Simple dehydration at severe enough levels also causes cognitive deterioration. Men who had started the ordeal mentally sharp were now confused, slow, and emotionally unstable. Fear was morphing into something else, a kind of desperate, fragile hope. Many of the men had concluded that they were going to die, but they had not yet given up. They clung to the possibility that rescue was coming. They watched the sky constantly for planes. They looked at the horizon for ships. Nothing came. Day 4, August 2nd, 1945. This was the fourth morning. Of the approximately 890 men who had entered the water, hundreds had already died. The groups were fractions of their original size. The sea around them was full of bodies. Harlan Twibble, who had started with 325 men in his group, had watched the number shrink day by day. He did head counts. He tried to keep the men talking, tried to maintain hope. We tried to keep the men thinking that they would be saved, but there was no way in God's green earth that I knew we were going to be saved. Young Harold Bray, 17 years old, had somehow survived 4 days and 4 nights in the water. He was dangerously dehydrated. He was burned. He was exhausted beyond anything he had ever experienced in his short life. But he was alive. Magellan Williams, who had a pregnant fiancée waiting for him at home, was not.
Now, here is the science sidebar, because you need to understand what was happening to the bodies and minds of the men floating in that water in order to understand the full horror of what came next. The human body can survive for approximately 3 weeks without food. It can survive for only approximately 3 to 5 days without fresh water, and in hot conditions, like floating in the direct sun in the Pacific Ocean in late July, that window shrinks dramatically. The men of the Indianapolis had no fresh water at all. None. The Kapok life jackets they were wearing gave them no access to food or water. The few life rafts that had been launched carried emergency rations, but there were not nearly enough for nearly 900 men. Most men had nothing. Within the first 24 hours, the men began to feel the effects of dehydration, intense thirst, dry mouth, headaches, dizziness. By day 2, those effects intensified enormously. The throat becomes so dry that swallowing becomes painful. The eyes begin to sink back into the skull. The skin becomes dry and cracked. The ability to think clearly begins to deteriorate. This is when the worst temptation arrived. The men were surrounded by water, miles and miles and miles of it in every direction, and they were desperately, agonizingly thirsty. Drinking the seawater was the obvious answer. It was everywhere. All they had to do was reach down and drink. But drinking seawater is a death sentence. Here is why. The salt water in the Pacific Ocean contains approximately 35 grams of salt per liter. The human body can process and excrete a maximum of approximately 8 to 10 grams of salt per liter of urine. This means that for every liter of seawater a person drinks, their body requires more than 3 liters of fresh water to process and eliminate the salt. Drinking seawater does not hydrate you. It accelerates dehydration at a catastrophic rate. The first effect of saltwater poisoning is a false sense of relief. The act of drinking, even salt water, triggers receptors in the mouth and throat that briefly signal hydration. For a few minutes, the men who drank seawater felt better. Then came the reality. Within 30 to 60 minutes, the salt poisoning would begin. The brain, desperate to process the overwhelming salt load, begins pulling water from its own cells. This causes rapid neurological deterioration. The man begins to experience intense nausea and vomiting, which further accelerates fluid loss. His muscles begin to cramp, his heart rate increases abnormally. And then come the hallucinations. The hallucinations experienced by saltwater poisoned survivors were documented extensively in the accounts that came out after the rescue. They were not vague or dreamlike, they were vivid, specific, and terrifyingly convincing. Men hallucinated that the Indianapolis was just below the surface of the water, intact and functional. Some dove beneath the surface to enter the ship, to find food in the galley, to drink fresh milk from the refrigerators. They were found floating face down by their companions. Men hallucinated that they could see islands on the horizon. They swam toward those islands. They swam until they disappeared. Men hallucinated that their companions were Japanese enemy combatants. They attacked their own shipmates, drowning men who were still alive in the grip of a terror that felt completely real to them. Dr. Lewis Haynes, the ship's chief medical officer and one of the survivors, later recalled watching men succumb to this process in vivid detail. The real young ones, you take away their hope, you take away their water and food, they would drink salt water and then would go fast. They would get diarrhea, then get more dehydrated, then become very maniacal, he said in an oral history. Haynes himself, a trained physician who knew exactly what was happening to his body, admitted that he fought off hallucinations for all 4 days. He said, "It was amazing how everyone would see the same thing. Even I fought hallucinations on and off, but something always brought me back." On the morning of August 2nd, 1945, the 4th day after the sinking, Lieutenant Wilbur Gwynn was flying a PV-1 Ventura patrol bomber on a routine anti-submarine patrol over the Philippine Sea. He was not looking for survivors. He was not searching for a missing ship. He was doing a standard patrol. There was nothing unusual about the mission. During the flight, Gwynn's crew encountered a problem with a new type of trailing antenna they were testing. The antenna had lost its counterweight. A crew member had to go back into the tail of the aircraft to try to fix it manually. As the crew member was working on the antenna problem, he happened to glance down at the water below. He saw what looked like an oil slick. He told Gwynn. Gwynn adjusted his course to investigate. From the cockpit of his patrol bomber, flying low over the glittering surface of the Philippine Sea, Lieutenant Gwynn saw something that stopped his heart. Men. Hundreds of men floating in the water. He immediately radioed a report, many men in the water, and his location. The time was approximately 11 in the morning on August 2nd. The men of the USS Indianapolis had been in the water for 84 hours. Within hours of Gwynn's report, a PBY Catalina flying boat commanded by Lieutenant Adrian Marks arrived on the scene. Marks circled low over the area and saw immediately that men were being attacked by sharks as he watched. He had to make a decision instantly. Landing a PBY Catalina in open ocean was extremely dangerous. The aircraft was not designed for it. Large swells could tear the hull apart. He had received no orders to land. Standard protocol was to drop supplies and wait for surface ships. Marks landed anyway. He brought his aircraft down in the Philippine Sea, in waters filled with sharks and bodies, and began pulling survivors aboard. He pulled men out of the water and packed them into every available space in the aircraft, along the fuselage, across the wings. When he had no more interior space, he strapped men to the exterior of the wings with rope. His plane would never fly again. It was too badly damaged by the landing to be salvageable. It was eventually scuttled after its occupants were transferred to arriving ships. Lieutenant Marks never regretted it for a second. The USS Cecil J. Doyle arrived on the scene that evening and began pulling men from the water. Doyle's commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Clater, made another extraordinary decision. He shone the ship's powerful searchlight directly upward into the night sky, pointed at the clouds, creating a beacon of diffused light visible for miles across the dark ocean. He was risking submarine attack. A ship with its searchlight on is visible to a submarine from enormous distances. He did it anyway, hoping that men still alive in the water would see the light and know that help was coming. Through the night of August 2nd and into the morning of August 3rd, rescue ships pulled men from the water. When the last survivor was brought aboard on August 3rd, the count was completed. Of the 1,195 men who had been aboard the USS Indianapolis on the night of July 29, 1945, only 316 were alive. 879 men were dead. It was and remains to this day the greatest single loss of life at sea from a single ship in the history of the United States Navy. What happened after the rescue is, in many ways, the most infuriating chapter of this entire story. The survivors were brought to hospitals and naval facilities in the Philippines and on Guam. Many were in critical condition, severely dehydrated, suffering from saltwater poisoning, covered in chemical burns from the fuel oil that had coated the water around the sinking ship, with shark bite wounds, sunburns so severe that skin was peeling from their bodies in sheets. They received medical treatment. Some died in hospital despite the rescue. And then the Navy, the same Navy that had failed to escort the Indianapolis, failed to tell her captain about Japanese submarines in his path, failed to act on her distress signals, and failed to notice when she didn't arrive as scheduled, began looking for someone to blame. They found Captain Charles McVeigh. McVeigh had survived. He had been among the men rescued from the water. He was brought to Guam, then to Washington. He sat before a formal naval inquiry. He gave his account of the sinking. And then, in November 1945, 5 months after the ship went down, he was formally court-martialed. The charges against him were two: failing to order abandoned ship and hazarding his ship by failing to zigzag.
He was cleared of the first charge. The evidence was clear that he had ordered abandoned ship. The chaos of the sinking had simply prevented that order from being transmitted to all parts of the ship in time. He was convicted of the second charge, hazarding his ship by failing to zigzag. Now let's think about this for a moment. Captain McVeigh's orders specifically said to zigzag at his discretion, weather permitting. He was not ordered to zigzag. He was given discretion. He chose, in poor night visibility, that zigzagging was unnecessary. That was his right under his orders. The Navy had not told him there was a Japanese submarine operating directly in his path. He made the best decision he could with the information available to him. And here is the most extraordinary part of this court-martial. The Navy called Commander Mochitsuda Hashimoto, the Japanese submarine commander who had sunk the Indianapolis, as a witness. They brought him to Washington to testify against McVeigh. Hashimoto testified that zigzagging would have made absolutely no difference. His submarine had been tracking the Indianapolis for long enough, his firing solution had been precise enough, and his torpedoes had been accurate enough that the Indianapolis was going to be hit regardless of what McVeigh did. If the ship had been zigzagging, he said, he would simply have adjusted his aim. Despite this testimony, McVeigh was convicted. He was the only captain in the entire history of the United States Navy to be court-martialed for losing a ship to enemy action during wartime. Think about that. Not for incompetence, not for negligence, for being torpedoed by an enemy submarine during a war, while following his orders with no escort and no warning. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, the most senior officer in the Navy, reviewed the conviction and remitted McVeigh's sentence, restoring him to active duty. But the conviction itself was never overturned. It stood on McVeigh's record. He served out the rest of his career and retired in 1949 as a Rear Admiral. He went home to Connecticut. And then the letters started arriving. The families of the men who had died on the Indianapolis, families who were grieving, who were angry, who needed someone to blame, had been told that Captain McVeigh had been convicted of hazarding his ship. So they wrote to him. "Merry Christmas," read one letter that arrived at McVeigh's home during the holiday season. "Our family's holiday would be a lot merrier if you hadn't killed my son." There were hundreds of letters. Some were angry, some were vicious, some contained outright threats. They arrived every Christmas, every anniversary of the sinking, and seemingly at random throughout the year. McVeigh never responded publicly. He answered some letters from families individually, with compassion and without defensiveness. He wrote that he was sorry for their loss. He did not defend himself. He simply absorbed the pain. He grew increasingly isolated. His wife died in 1961, leaving him alone in the Connecticut house. The letters kept coming. The grief never lifted. On November 6, 1968, McVeigh's gardener arrived to find him on the back porch. He was dead. He had shot himself with a pistol. He was 70 years old. He was found with a toy sailor in his hand. Nobody knows exactly what that meant. Nobody ever asked him. The man who had done everything he was ordered to do, the man whose conviction had been remitted by the most senior officer in the Navy, the man whose guilt was questioned by the very enemy commander who had sunk his ship, had finally been broken by 23 years of letters telling him he was a murderer. He never knew that he would eventually be exonerated. That came 32 years after his death. In 1996, 51 years after the sinking of the USS Indianapolis, an 11-year-old boy in Florida sat down on a Saturday night to watch the movie Jaws with his father. The boy's name was Hunter Scott. There is a famous scene in Jaws where the character of Quint, a grizzled shark hunter played by Robert Shaw, delivers a monologue about being a survivor of the Indianapolis sinking. He describes the sharks, the 4 days in the water, the men dying around him. It is one of the most powerful scenes in the history of American cinema. Hunter Scott watched that scene and couldn't stop thinking about it. He started researching the real story. He went to the library. He found books about the Indianapolis. He started interviewing survivors, calling them on the telephone, writing letters, traveling to meet them. He interviewed nearly 150 Indianapolis survivors in total. Every single one of them told him the same thing. Captain McVeigh was not responsible for what happened. Every single one of them believed he had been unjustly convicted. Hunter Scott entered his research into a school history project competition in 1997. He won. Then he took his research to Congress. In 1998, Hunter Scott, then a seventh grader from Pensacola, Florida, testified before the United States Senate Armed Services Committee, making the case for Captain McVeigh's posthumous exoneration. He was 12 years old. He sat before a Senate committee and laid out the evidence he had compiled clearly and methodically, and explained why the conviction was unjust. Congress listened. In October 2000, the United States Congress passed a resolution that Captain McVeigh's record should reflect that he was exonerated for the loss of the Indianapolis. President Bill Clinton signed it. Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, the Japanese commander who had sunk the ship and testified that zigzagging would have made no difference, had actually written to the Senate in support of McVeigh's exoneration. His letter read, "Our peoples have forgiven each other for that terrible war. Perhaps it is time your peoples forgave Captain McVeigh for the humiliation of his unjust conviction." Hashimoto died 5 days before the resolution was signed. McVeigh had been dead for 32 years, but the 316 survivors who had spent decades fighting for their captain's name finally had their answer. He had been exonerated. The record would now show that Charles Butler McVeigh III was not responsible for the loss of his ship. Hunter Scott, the boy who had watched Jaws on a Saturday night, went on to graduate from the University of North Carolina, join the Navy as an officer, and eventually serve at the Pentagon as protocol officer for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Of the 316 men who were pulled from the water on August 2nd and 3rd, 1945, most went on to live full lives, though none of them ever fully escaped what had happened. Harlan Twibble, the young Naval Academy graduate who had organized and led his group of 325 survivors through 4 days in the water, remained in the Navy. He served through the Korean War. He eventually retired due to health issues connected to his time in the Pacific Ocean. He moved to Florida. He became successful in business. He built a life. But he never stopped remembering. Nobody who survived those 4 days ever did. Richard Felon, the Michigan sailor who went 5 days without food or water, was so weak when the rescuers arrived that he could not climb a rope ladder to board the Cecil J. Doyle. He had to be hauled up manually. He was discharged from the Navy in August 1946. He married a woman named Joanne in 1951. They had 6 children, 17 grandchildren, and 3 great-grandchildren. Joanne died in 2002. Richard died in 2021 at 94, one of the last survivors. Harold Bray, 17 years old when the ship went down, went on to live a long life. As of this recording, he is the last living survivor of the USS Indianapolis. He is in his late 90s, living in Benicia, California. His hometown recently erected a life-size bronze statue of him as that young sailor, just 17, just out of boot camp, about to board the most fateful ship of his life. He responded to the statue dedication with quiet humility. And Magellan Williams, the young black sailor with the pregnant fiancée, never came home. His fiancée gave birth to their child without him. His family spent decades trying to ensure that his story and the stories of the 28 African American sailors who served on the Indianapolis were remembered and honored. In 2023, a book called Heroes in the Shadows was published, documenting their service and their sacrifice for the first time. The families of many of the men who died are still waiting, still asking questions, still looking for closure that may never fully come. Because the wreck of the Indianapolis itself, which sits at a depth of 5,500 meters, nearly 3.5 miles below the surface of the Philippine Sea, was only discovered in August 2017, 72 years after she sank. A research vessel funded by Paul Allen, co-founder of Microsoft, finally located the wreckage. The Navy has declared the wreck site a war grave. It will not be disturbed. The hundreds of men who went down with the ship on July 30th, 1945, are still there. The official record now shows that Captain McVeigh was exonerated. The Navy acknowledged its failures. The survivors received the Congressional Gold Medal in 2018, 73 years after the sinking. But questions remain. Why exactly were the 3 distress signals not acted upon? The Navy's official position is that it was a series of individual failures rather than a systemic cover-up, but the intelligence about the I-58 submarine operating directly in the Indianapolis's path, intelligence that was classified until the early 1990s and was deliberately withheld from McVeigh's defense counsel during his court-martial, suggests that the Navy knew more than it admitted. Why was McVeigh specifically chosen for court-martial when other officers, who had made far more consequential errors, the officer who dismissed the distress signal, the port officials who failed to report the ship overdue, faced no consequences at all? The answer, suggested by McVeigh's own father, was dark and personal. The Navy's senior admiral at the time, Admiral Ernest King, had a personal grudge against McVeigh's family stretching back decades. When McVeigh's father had been the senior officer, he had placed a letter of reprimand in King's file for bringing women aboard a ship. King never forgot. King never forgot a grudge, the elder McVeigh reportedly said. Now he's used my son to get back at me. That allegation has never been proven, but Admiral Nimitz, who remitted McVeigh's sentence, also said privately that he believed the court-martial should never have happened. And there is one final question that still haunts this story. In those 4 days in the water, between the moment the Indianapolis sank and the moment Gwynn's patrol plane happened to fly over the right patch of ocean, how close did rescue come? Military records show that at least 11 separate moments occurred in which available information, if acted upon correctly, would have led to rescue. 11 chances. Any one of them could have saved hundreds of lives. Richard Thelen, the Michigan sailor, went 5 days without food or water and survived. The men who died on day 4, men who were still alive when rescue finally came but too far away from the rescue ships to be reached in time, they might have survived too, if any one of those 11 moments had gone differently. The last survivor, Harold Bray, is still alive. He's one of the most remarkable human beings on Earth. A man who was 17 years old when the impossible happened, who survived 4 days in the Philippine Sea with no food, no water, and sharks in the water around him, and who has carried that story through an entire lifetime. He doesn't talk about it much. Most of the survivors didn't. Many of their families, their children, their grandchildren, found out their fathers or grandfathers had been on the Indianapolis, not from the men themselves, but from watching a movie, from watching Quint's monologue in Jaws. They went to their fathers and said, "Dad, were you on that ship?" And the fathers said yes, and often that was all they would say. Because some things you survive, but surviving is not the same as leaving behind. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. The story of the USS Indianapolis is one of the most extraordinary stories in the entire history of naval warfare. A story of heroism, of survival, of catastrophic institutional failure, and of a man whose name was dragged through the mud for doing nothing wrong, and who never lived to see himself cleared.
If this video moved you, the best thing you can do is go and look up the names of the men who didn't come home. They are documented at project.888.org, where biographies are being written for all 888 members of the crew who were lost. They deserve to be remembered. If you enjoyed this video, I would really appreciate it if you gave it a like. It helps the channel enormously. And if you have a story suggestion for a future video, there is a form in the description where you can submit it. Some of the best stories on this channel have come from viewer suggestions. Thank you again for watching, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.